Howdy, folks. It's David Cobb. Welcome to Democracy in Action. You know, as I like to say, the revolution may not be televised, but it will be brought to you over this broadcast, the Green News Network, where we have conversation that is unfiltered by the corporate masters. We actually have a conversation about news, information, and analysis, and we bring you folks and voices from the front lines of the struggle. Sometimes it's impacted communities. Sometimes it's social change agents who are working within existing organizations and networks. Sometimes it's my personal friend. In this instance, it's a hat trick because Shahid Buttar is all three. Shahid is a people's lawyer, a straight-up genius, and I say that with candor and love and affection and sincerity. He is the director of grassroots advocacy for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He is also the former executive director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. He is also a kick-ass, dope spoken word poet, and I can say that with certainty because, Shahid, I want to tell the story of when I first met you in 2005. At the time, you were with the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. I think you were managing their communications at the time. I met you at an Independent Progressive Politics Network conference. You said brilliant things. I was so impressed. And then that night, I remember, I think, walking through the streets of D.C., DuPont Circle, I believe it was, there I heard a crowd going wild for a spoken word poet, and it was you. Shahid Buttar, welcome to Democracy in Action.
Thanks so much for having me, David. You're much, much too kind.
No, I'm just exactly kind enough. And I got to tell you, Shahid, I would love to get into some of the work that you do on countercultural activism at the Burning Man Journal. I'd love to get into some of your electronic music and spoken word poetry. I'm going to tell viewers, though, if you really, really want to do yourself a favor, spend a little bit of time. His name is Shahid Buttar, Buttar. Check him out. It's amazing art. It's amazing culture expressions. But I do want to dive right in, Shahid, with a question about you. Because one of the things that we've noticed on Democracy in Action is that folks are really interested in you, the individual. So I'm going to give you a moment to say, how is it that you became a social change agent? You could be making one of the things that we've noticed tons of money as a lawyer, but instead you're doing this work. I want to know why.
I suppose ultimately I'm an immigrant, and I'm very conscious of the freedoms that my parents, I would say my forebears in the abstract, but really my parents, I'm aware of the sacrifices that they sought, particularly for the freedom and opportunity that this country promises, or at least has long promised. And I feel a very deep connection to those values. I'm rabidly patriotic. I tried to enlist in the Marines when I was 12. I grew up in rural Missouri, and I was pretty brainwashed at the time. That was my expression of public service then. And, the idea of defending the values that rural Missouri enticed my country, my family to travel the world to be in this country, that really matters to me. Freedom is not an abstract concept at all, and I'm painfully aware of how ephemeral our rights are, how easily lost they are, how horrendous and horrifying life could be without them, and how on the brink of how sharp a precipice we stand, before a very different kind of existence, the likes of which, I shudder to contemplate. So, yeah, I think of all of this as a prevention strategy for mass atrocity. and this is what it looks like to me to defend the Republic.
Shahid, I'm really so grateful that you framed it the way you did, because I, like you, was brainwashed in a rural community, and it's interesting. I'll speak for myself. Growing up in not just working class but abject poverty, I knew from a very early age that the economic system was exploitive and unfair. But as a mostly straight white male, I bought all the rest of the creation myth of liberty, justice, and equality. But you know what really, oftentimes, it just sits in me. You see, that creation myth works because it's so powerful, because every human being, not just Americans, but the concepts, the promise of liberty, justice, and equality, the myth, again, is a very powerful narrative. It really speaks to the best of what human beings want in life.
I think that's right. And I would even say it speaks to the best of what our country can be, right? When we were openly welcoming our the world's huddled, tired, poor masses yearning to be free. Like that's what made this country great. It was that sensibility of openness towards new people. It was an openness to sharing, while at the time, everybody went through lots of cycles of both, vigilante repression and state repression and discrimination, and by that I mean literally every community that's come here. And in that vein, I think of being a Muslim American in this day and age as basically, earning our stripes as Americans, right? By taking our role as the group du jour to be vilified. At the same time as all those things are true, I do think that our nation has at times stood for those principles well. I think it's been a very long time. I take some inspiration from President Eisenhower as much as I do from the founding fathers. I think of the founding fathers as having attempted to create a legacy of freedom, however, imperfect and limited it was in their time slice. But, words on paper that we've been able to hang a lot on since. And I see at the moment, not only in President Eisenhower, sort of his worst fears coming to pass with, the deep state sort of eclipsing democracy in America, but now in the very recent past, an escalation to the constitutional crisis that I think places a great deal at risk, including our nation's capacity to stand for those values meaningfully in practice.
Shahid, it's interesting, right? Because for me, I, like you, am not a founder fetishist. On the other hand, I do contextualize the reality that breaking from monarchy as a form of rule is a big deal, right? I mean, the experiment of genuine democratic republic self-governance is an amazing thing. And, one lawyer to another, one of the things that I remind people is this notion of codifying inherent and alienable rights that human beings can count on, and that government shall not be able to interfere with. You see, the Bill of Rights is a really big deal.
Hell yeah, right? It's huge. I mean, the First and the Fourth Amendments are world historical to no less an extent than the creation of the Magna Carta 1,200 years before. If at the time it was the sort of like landed nobility in the UK fighting from the crown the right to trial, which incidentally we have, for all intents and purposes, lost in the relatively recent past. And then, we step forward in time to an era in the 18th century when these basically colonists, slaveholding colonists in the U.S. create this notion of a limited government. And specifically, if you juxtapose the promises of the First Amendment with our contemporary reality, right? I mean, the First Amendment says that Congress, which is the government, will make no law to abridge the freedoms of speech, association, assembly. And think about it now. If you want to assemble, you're doing it in a free speech zone. It's like the idea that like the country used to be a free speech zone. It's been flipped on its head, right? Or the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. We fought a revolution largely over the practice of the British Crown searching people's houses randomly without any specification to existing threat because of a general warrants. There is a threat to public safety, ergo we get to search anyone we want. And that was an offensive enough principle 250 years ago that these slaveholding colonists waged a war of independence against it. We have accepted that in the contemporary United States in the last 15 years with nary a peep. And I feel like the erosion of our constitutional commitments in our culture is what enables the disregard for those values by our institutions. And I think the fact of the enormity of what we are letting slip through our fingers is only starting to emerge in people's minds now that there is an interesting figure at the helm. Interesting figure is that you're being too kind, and I'm not going to let you get up with it. Indeed, I am. I think that Donald Trump, as president of the United States, is engaged in a full frontal assault on what I perceive to be the core American values. So I'm not going to actually let him up and pretend to give him a chance. He's been incredibly explicit and clear as a candidate, what he stood for. His first 100 days have been exactly what he promised. He is a dangerous threat. One of the things that I do, although want to be super clear about here is, the founders, as an experiment in limited government,
the problem from my perspective, of course, was not in any of the core principles and values. It was the application of it, and specifically the definition of who is a person who can actually assert those rights. Right. Because, of course, in the founding, the Constitution begins with those hallowed words, "We the people." They can give me chills if I allow it, but I don't allow myself to go there anymore, because I know explicitly and clearly now that in 1789, when that document was ratified, the only legal persons were landowning, wealthy, white male slaveholders. Right. The problem wasn't in the framework. The problem was always in who could actually be a person and claim those rights.
But we can't assess it only in that frozen moment in time, right? If we fast forward the tape or the DVD or the MP4 or whatever the streaming equivalent is, like we come to the contemporary history, and over that time, we the people have done a lot to shake loose concessions basically from those power holders, right? I mean, the story of women's suffrage, I think, is an incredibly, just as big a world historical example as the recognition of limited powers in the First and Fourth Amendment. That was a peaceful movement of people to secure what I would describe as relatively minimal in procedural voting rights, but rights for a massive class of previously disenfranchised people. And all that is to say that our work remains very much undone and cut out for us. We, the people, are a long way off from fully securing the promise that the Constitution presents. But I see the Constitution as a promise, basically a pathway for us to secure our rights that we are still, unfortunately, I think, not only far from the finish line, but I fear that the finish line is moving further away at times. But
I appreciate the pushback and the push and pull of this conversation, because I think that you're right. We cannot look at the Constitution or the founding as a frozen moment in time. And one of the things that you've reminded me and viewers is that the entire history of this country has been a struggle for justice, to make the promise Absolutely. A reality, and to realize it. So, I do want to make sure that we talk a little bit about Electronic Frontier Foundation and your particular project. But before we do, I want to just give Mark Anderson a chance, because he sort of picked up on some of the things that you were saying. He asked, but when we get to a point when those who have the money are above the law and those who have none are subject to all the laws that the rich have made, then it's proof that it's not fair. And more accurately, he says, when we get to a point when those who have the money, that was the point. So, your comments?
Two years ago, almost to the day, I was arrested in the Senate after a conclusion of a hearing in the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, and I'd asked, at the end of the hearing, I asked the Director of National Intelligence at the time, James Clapper, how he justified never facing a charge for perjury for lying to Congress about the fact of mass surveillance. This was in March 2013, 3 months before the Snowden revelations proved his false statement under oath, self-serving false statement under oath, to be a lie. How he justified never being charged for perjury in the same country where a man at the time, his name was Eric Garner, had very recently died, essentially killed in the street, a victim of extrajudicial assassination by the NYPD, who was also never charged with a crime. The crime of which Eric Garner was, for which he was killed without a trial, was selling loose cigarettes without a license. And it was a suspicion of his engaging in that act without a trial. Clapper never faced a charge, but the fact of his lie is a matter of public record. It's been seen by hundreds of millions of people. It's about a matter of grave global importance, going to the heart of this, the good parts of the Constitution. Right. And apparently, with an office, you can get away with lying to the people's representatives about an issue that is as fundamental as the American Revolution, right? I mean, the struggle against general warrants defined the Republic in an era of a national security crisis. And now, again, for the executive branch to get away with lying to Congress about issues like that, for the courts to bury their heads in the sand and fail to reach these kinds of issues on the merits, I feel like, again, We are witnessing the erosion of our institutional bulwarks to defend our constitutional rights. And to your point, David, I think with respect to the historical inadequacy of those rights, it is because of the erosion of our constitutional commitments and culture that the institutions are able to get away with this, right? I mean, in the 70s, when a bunch of draft-dodging hippies brought documents to Congress showing that the FBI was suppressing and neutralizing domestic social movements, Congress took 2 years, conducted an investigation, and at least tried to end COINTELPRO. Snowden revealed more than that, and Congress has remained essentially asleep at the switch ever since. So, and I think part of the reason for that is that there hasn't been nearly enough alarm, and we could chase that thread and suggest that the alarm, unfortunately, has been on too many fronts. You know, it's like our culture's adrenal glands are burned out because we're mobilizing every weekend against the, latest crisis, particularly under this administration, because it seems, far from content to rest on its hands, before abusing the rights of some other community.
I'm really glad that you sort of went there, because you take us to the next sort of point. And that is, I want you to give a quick give our viewers the elevator speech on the Electronic Frontier Foundation generally, and then segue into the work that you're doing in your capacity as the Director of Grassroots Advocacy.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, David. EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, was started in the early 90s by some of the Internet's pioneers. These were people who saw the writing on the wall and wanted to keep this new space free. They saw that this could be a liberatory space for humanity that could connect people and liberate information, and I think they feared that it could become a tool for social control. And our goal is to preserve civil liberties online. We conduct impact litigation, so we sue the NSA in federal court. We have 2 of those cases at the moment, one of which has been standing for over 10 years. We fight for your right of access to information and culture and science in Congress, in the courts. That's in the face often of not just state threats, but corporate threats. Corporate right holders often lock up culture, film, video, music. They lock up science through the patent regime. And, we're interested in making sure that innovation and culture are the values that are promoted online rather than corporate profit. And we increasingly, in my project at EFF in the activism arena, our activism team is long engaged online in sharing information about digital rights issues and law and policy opportunities, both threats and opportunities. My project at EFF in the grassroots advocacy arena is to mobilize communities in real space, offline, to secure their rights, to essentially cultivate communities in real life of people who care about their rights online and are willing to, show up at a meeting, for instance, to talk about it. Those kinds of 1.0 civic engagement tools are incredibly important platforms, and the emergence of platforms online, like the social networks that people use, should not distract us from the time-tested 1.0 tools that we have to continue using. And I fear that the loss of some of those tools is part of the reason why we're in this mess civilizationally, is that we have allowed our civil society, not just through the internet, I think through a variety of means, a multiplicity of factors, I think, have conspired to erode civil society in the United States, particularly. And part of the project at the moment is both to inform people about how our digital rights are under attack, how our civil liberties more broadly are under attack, how the Constitution itself, the Republic, is under attack from within, I dare say, to acquaint them with the levers they can pull within their reach to build a movement in microcosms, to fight down the national security agencies, to fight back the corporations, to reclaim our rights online, and particularly to do that with a vision that not only acknowledges the current landscape, but looks beyond it, right? I feel like there's a lot of concern at the moment, appropriately, about the president and beyond personalities or policies. And as terrified as I am of all the horrors that will emerge in the next 4 years, I mean, mass surveillance, we're in our 4th presidential administration, depending on how you count it, that under that regime, and mass surveillance in the 80s was a big enough deal for. Go ahead. No, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
But I'm really glad that you said that, because it's really important to recognize that the neoliberalism that we've been experiencing over the last 30 years has brought us to this point.
Oh, yeah.
Every president since Eisenhower has engaged in more surveillance, than their predecessor. Every single one of them, whether a Democrat or a Republican. This is objectively true.
No question.
And I'm especially eager to get to Dan Amman, who says, look, due to the controlled structural premise of our current government and the overall culture, he asked, should we push an agenda of radical non-compliance and self-sovereignty?
It's not crazy. The challenge, I would say, there is that radical non-compliance and self-sovereignty requires organization, at least mutual aid in voluntary communities, if not robust movements that can operate at scale. And, I fear at the moment that we have neither. I've heard calls, for instance, for a general strike, which are fascinating to me, but without labor unions, given the erosion in labor participation in the United States, pulling off a general strike is I would love to see it happen. I think it would be challenging. We have to get there. I think that's a great goal to aspire towards. But part of what radical non-compliance looks like, I think, is the easy forms of non-compliance, which is to say dissent. Dissent is a form of non-compliance, and it's a form of non-compliance that at times is entirely too invisible. With enough dissent, we can shift levers such that radical non-compliance becomes unnecessary. We could tolerate the outcome such that we might be, able to comply without having to abdicate our, agency as moral beings. But I do think that dissent and engagement is absolutely critical. I fear that radical non-compliance can be rhetorically untethered and easily taken advantage of by a state inclined to assert control using incidents of unrest as a pretext.
I got to do two things. Number one, I have to break the fourth wall and say our technical producer, Michael O'Neill, even though I cannot see him, I know is grinning ear to ear because we just, Jill Stein, myself, Alicia Figueroa, the entire team, Michael O'Neill, as well, we engaged in a political discussion around general strikes, and Michael made the exact same point that you're making, Shahid. He said, look, the word strike is a powerful tool. We should not casually toss it about. We should understand that to use that tool requires a cultural awareness and a level of organization that we're just not ready for. And at the same time, I would submit this, that the ability to engage in dissent and to push that dissent is a way, there is something to be said for the notion of engaging in self-sovereignty is not an either-or proposition. And one of the things that I tell I come out of a tradition of anarchist self-determination, but also, as you know, Shahid, I ran for president of the United States. And people say, well, how can you square those two things? And I say, look, the anarcho-syndicalists of Spain engaged in elections. Rosa Luxemburg engaged in elections. I tell people this, you may not believe in the state, but the state believes in you.
Yes, it does. and we use you, right.
If we are going to be serious, then we have to use all the tools available. I am absolutely a believer in radical noncompliance against injustice. I am absolutely a believer in the practitioner of self-sovereignty, and I believe in engaging in electoral politics and culture jamming and culture shifting. Right really, part of the problem is it's not either or. It's got to be both and.
Yeah, a diversity of tactics, I think, makes sense. I mean, when I hear radical noncompliance, what I hear is people disengaging, quite frankly, from the institutional processes that you described remaining important, even as we, for instance, use our bodies as measures and agents of dissent, right? I mean, I've certainly, I agree absolutely with the need to dissent vigorously. And at times that involves, communities taking on a measure of risk, perhaps. But like a strike, I would say radical noncompliance similarly is a term that we can use easily without recognizing all of the precursors that are required for it to be meaningful, and it's radical noncompliance is more than saying you don't like what's going on and yelling at your screen. Radical noncompliance involves, for most people, finding some people to work with. And I feel like that's something I always go back wherever people's, focuses might go, however their concerns might take shape. If you are dissatisfied with the status quo, however you denominate yourself, whatever set of policies you want to chase, the most crucial act of civic participation you can pursue is find people in real life who you can talk to, establish relationships, grow community, escalate your dissent, and perhaps start verging into resistance. But I think that idea of going into resistance is similarly more than a lot of people are prepared for, because we're so atomized. I think the atomization of our civilization, of our society, is a big part of our challenge at the moment.
Head Rock, the mayor of DC hip hop, a dear friend of mine, has a beat, and I think you know Hetty.
Absolutely.
Head Rock. And Hetty's got a beat that goes like this: if you want to change your situation, you better join an organization.
Yeah.
And it's always stuck with me, because the reality is that only through collective organizing can we actually exercise any power over either government or corporations or any institution. I do want to go now to Deborah Stacy, who asks, doesn't it seem like there are two sets of laws and awareness that is undermining the Constitution and the ability of the people to live in any kind of freedom? And then she says, thank you, Electronic Frontier Foundation. She agrees we absolutely need to show up in 3D space. Facebook is not going to advance our cause to reclaim our rights. So she's got two things. Number one, what can we do? And then she's asking, if it's not too bold, how are you funded for this amazing work that you're doing?
So the funding for EFF, we're a member-supported organization. So 35,000 people around the world contribute money to keep us going. We've got support from across the political spectrum within the United States. We've got support from around the world. We think of ourselves as guardians of the internet, and we're sort of, quite frankly, the internet will be here beyond any of the personalities, and we hope that we will be too, to represent that voice for liberty online. What can we do? I'd go back to just where we were finishing before, David, in terms of the organization. If you have concerns, and I'll speak directly to your listeners here, your viewers, if you have concerns about what's happening, particularly with the president, the most important thing you can do while thinking global is to act locally, which is to find neighbors, classmates, colleagues, acquaintances, people you're in the PTA with, right? Maybe, the other people you recreate with, the other folks at the community garden, right? The people that you go on walks with. Talk about your concerns, raise your voice. That is basically your freedom of speech. It's a reason it's in the First Amendment, because for the country to work, for the republic to function, you have to articulate your concerns. And then if you just start remixing your First Amendment rights after you speak, use assembly, bring people together to discuss those concerns, because whatever concerns you have that drive you to be concerned with what you're watching on the screen or what you're reading in the newspaper, you're not alone. And when you talk to people about those concerns, you can discover common ground. Now, that can just take the form of griping, or it can take the form of building and constructive engagement around dissent, to move beyond complaining into the space of deciding, okay, what will we do about it? I've heard a lot of discussion in the last few months about people writing letters. I'm excited to see it. It is perhaps described as the least we could do. It is also somewhat resignatory, because if we're writing individual letters to members of Congress, for instance, they're under no obligation to respond to us. It's an infinitesimal point of leverage. If we're going to write letters, one way to make that tactic effective is to share your letters with your neighbors so that they can sign them too, so that when you're writing, you're not just writing on your own behalf, but you're writing on behalf of what? An organization, whether it's explicitly denominated as such. You don't need a 501c3, you just need 3 people around a dinner table, right? That layer of organizing.
Let's remember, by the way, that Amnesty International actually started off first with somebody toasting freedom, getting arrested, and then a letter writing campaign followed.
I didn't know that story. That's fascinating.
It's a beautiful story. Shahid, I very rarely get a chance to teach you anything, so I'll take that little nugget.
I agree. You teach me a lot, brother.
Ellen Crockett actually says, have town hall meetings. And Ellen, I'm going to take your comment and weave it together with Dan and Mark's earlier conversation to just say, what I'm actually doing tonight when I get off this call is to go to a meeting where we are in study of libertarian municipalism, where we are literally looking at the Eureka, California City Charter to figure out how we can engage municipal governance with yes, we vote, but also how do we go beyond voting, right?
Yeah.
Engage in voting and going beyond voting. By the way, Jose Contreras says, go EFF with a big heart. So I want to give that information. So, Ellen, thank you for the idea of town hall meetings. And I think it's really important to recognize that coming together in those town hall meetings does not require that there be an elected official that we're sort of holding their feet to the fire at that moment. Yeah. Sometimes it's merely just developing our political education and shared analysis.
Absolutely. And a town hall meeting need not be the town. I mean, it can be your neighborhood. It can be your block. It can be your friends. You know, starting small. I feel like people sometimes aggrandize politics into this thing that is beyond their, for instance, social reach. You know, but and this is just to share, you know, what I'm doing after this, just to, you know, populate the mosaic of alternatives people can pursue. I live in a group house in San Francisco, and we're screening a documentary this evening, 13. About the rise of mass incarceration and the sort of, you know, replication of slavery basically through a different brand. And the idea of just coming together with your friends to screen a documentary and have a focused chat about whatever you just learned, that's an incredibly important act.
Plus, you can have a cocktail at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just saying.
Aspect. Well, right. I mean, that's a bigger deal, though. I mean, you're flippant just saying, but no, that's real, right? Whether it's
it's flippant and real. It can be both.
It can be both, right? But, you know, let's say the people that you share your concerns with are other people in the PTA, and you have young kids. You know, bring your kids together and have a play day. If you're all dog owners, like whatever the thing is that you actually enjoy doing, to organize around those things as well as your convictions. When you can cross convictions, shared convictions, with shared manners of recreation or shared affinities, or if, you know, there's a set of people who, you know, share your concerns and you like Thai food, you know what I mean? Like using the thing that you share an affinity for as the thing to continue bringing you together, and then just making sure that you have some discipline about getting to the question, what are we going to do about it? That is the crucial question that people have to ask each other and hold each other accountable for.
There's no doubt. Listen, questions are coming in fast and furious, so okay. I want to ask for a couple of quick, focused responses. Number one, Mark Duchesney asked, what do you think about this idea, creating a pledge to boycott federal income taxes until we get proportional representation and actually elections we can trust?
Wow. I wrote a paper 15 years ago arguing that proportional representation should be a constitutional mandate and the Supreme Court should intervene in the electoral system to provide it. So I'm all for it.
Stop stealing Shahid. Stop looking at Shahid's papers.
We're all in this together.
We are indeed. So I will give a shout out, Electronic Frontier Foundation, on the cutting edge of protecting civil liberties, especially on the internet. But if you're interested in, Mark, in proportional representation, check out our colleagues over at Fair Vote. They are the group that are looking at voting system reform. Mark Manley asks, what do you think about the recent bills proposed trying to impose huge fines and jail time for exercising protest and dissent?
Yeah, it's a huge threat to the republic. I think that it will also present an opportunity for the courts to either do their jobs of defending your rights from the executive branch, or as they have done in a disturbing range of cases, to bury their heads in the sand. The independence of the judiciary is a constitutional crux. We depend on it for our rights to have any vitality. And I think that one of the real threats to the republic is the erosion of the judiciary's independence. The preponderance of federal judges were prosecutors before they joined the bench. And I can't think of a more direct threat to judicial independence than to hire executive branch veterans to staff it and be the decision makers. And the results of that, I think, are all too clear in our jurisprudence. And
no doubt. Yeah, no, we could go a lot deeper. I want to get in another one quickly. Ash Smith asks, so tell us the current scoop on net neutrality. Where are we? So
the FCC is under the leadership of Chairman Ajit Pai, appointed by President Trump, likely will have its sights on targeting the net neutrality regulations that have kept the internet to be a free space that's open to innovation. If there are two particular tracks. There's two ways that could happen. One is through a regulatory track, which would require the FCC to engage in a notice and comment period. So we'll have plenty of warning if that happens, and we fully expect the internet to raise its voice if that happens. The track of which we are more fearful at the moment is the statutory track, because Congress, and we all know who is in Congress at the moment and leading the show there. If Congress grows inclined to act, it could conceivably strip the Federal Communications Commission of its power to regulate the internet. That sort of erosion would represent a very dangerous threat to the liberty of the internet, and also the capacity of the internet to enable our rights offline. As people are engaging your respective members of Congress, making sure that they understand the value of net neutrality is an absolute imperative. And I would describe it as this: ultimately, without net neutrality, we freeze the internet with the dominant actors in place who are in place today. That one reason the internet is because it's enabled disruption, and it's enabled new actors to disrupt older actors. And if net neutrality falls away, we will lose that principle of openness in a way that could be very destructive.
You know, I'm not a technologist, but one of the things that I recognize as the absolute magic of this technology is that it has given us the ability to talk to each other without the filters of either government or corporations. We can literally engage and question each other and challenge each other and organize together. There's something very magical about this medium. Shahid, the time just flew by. I do want to give you an opportunity for final thoughts, both on the Electronic Frontier Foundation as an organization, but also anything that you individually are up to, or EFF that you'd like our viewers to know about.
You're very kind. So at EFF, we're incubating a network called the Electronic Frontier Alliance. It's grassroots groups. They're all autonomous. They're 47 in 18 states. We are eager to recruit others. If you're concerned about digital rights, like, for instance, your opportunity dissent in an era of mass surveillance, and you have 3 friends, we want to help you. So reach out to us at organizing@EFF.org. There's a huge opportunity, I would just say, at the local level, particularly to prompt city councils to impose transparency on police surveillance. That's the teeth of the military-industrial complex, the outer edge of the mass surveillance regime. Nowadays, beyond the 3-letter agencies in Washington, are the police departments, 18,000 police departments around the U.S., increasingly deploying military-grade surveillance technology. And there's no reason for those purchases to be invisible to local policymakers. Concerned residents who ask local policymakers to empower themselves to simply conduct their oversight responsibilities more vigorously, it's an easy pitch. And it's a powerful pitch, because when that policy in place, with transparency in place, subsequent opportunities emerge. Transparency begets opportunities for activists, for policymakers, for journalists. I think of secrecy. Executive secrecy is one of the central struggles and threats that we have to the republic. It emerges across context. And so eroding secrecy by mandating transparency, starting where we are strongest, which is to say the smallest jurisdictional layer of which you're a part, your local community, matters a lot. Reach out to us at organizing@EFF.org. I'll say I have a new track out I just released last week. Looking forward to connecting with any of your listeners. And I would just take us back to we the people. We might be down, but we are far from out.
No, we are. That's right. We're getting larger, stronger, and better organized actually every day. And I do want to say that for those of you who are watching locally from Humboldt County and or Eureka, Arcata, it is my very distinct pleasure to say that Shahid Buttar is going to actually come up from the Bay Area to Eureka on March 20th. He'll be doing an event at Humboldt State University. In addition to that, I'm going to do it. I hope to do an interview with him for our cable access program. And if we're lucky, we'll be able to also do some spoken word poetry and slam and other art and culture work together. So hit me up. You know how to get me on Facebook, and we'll do that. And the last thing I do want to say is 2 things. Number one, thank you to Michael O'Neill, our technical producer, who does this as a labor of love. Thank you, Michael, so much for the work that you do. And secondly, I got to say, Christian Hansen, thank you for the comment that I look like Professor X from the Marvel movie. I don't know if that as a compliment or a dig. I'm going to take it as a compliment. Nice. And I thank you so much for all the questions that we weren't able to get to. It was a very rich conversation. Shahid Buttar, thank you for what you do. Much love to you.
Much love to you, brother. Thanks for having me.
Peace.